All right, guys, we're back with Standard 5, Part 2. And again, Standard 5 does cover ecology and ecological relationships. We've already talked about how nutrients are recycled, and now we're going to look at the flow of energy. Remember, energy cannot be recycled because energy can't be created and it cannot be destroyed. It can only be transformed or transferred. And so remember our two cell organelles that are instrumental in the transformation and transfer of energy. It's going to be chloroplast, which is able to transform light energy into chemical energy, store the energy in the bond of carbohydrates, and mitochondria efficiently breaks down those nutrients and transfers that chemical energy from the bonds of the nutrients into the bonds of the cell's preferred energy molecule, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. All right, now, energy enters the earth in the form of radiant or light energy, so all energy comes from the sun, and that energy is going to be taken in by producers when it comes from the sun. Now, those producers are going to be called autotrophs, or more specifically, they are photoautotrophs. Photo means light. And those photoautotrophs are able to transform that light energy into chemical energy. Photoautotrophs or producers are going to be consumed, so therefore the energy is going to transfer from producers to consumers, and the consumers that eat the producers are serving as primary consumers. Now, these primary consumers are going to be the herbivores or omnivores. If a consumer is eaten, a primary consumer is eaten by either an omnivore or a carnivore, and those make them secondary consumers. And then this can go on for tertiary, quaternary, so forth and so on until we reach our top consumers. Now, the thing about this energy transfer is the organism is going to use some of the energy for its life processes, and as the energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next trophic level, some of it is going to be lost as heat. So what we have observed is that only about 10% of the energy that was available can be transferred to the next trophic level. So let's say producers take in 100,000 kilojoules of energy. That means consumers would only get about 10,000 kilojoules, it's 10% of what was available. And then those secondary consumers would take in about 1,000 kilojoules, tertiary would get 100 kilojoules, and our quaternary would get about 10 kilojoules of energy. So each time energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next, some of it is lost in the form of heat. Some of that energy that was available is used by the organism, so only about 10% is able to be passed on. Notice the direction of the arrows. When we are looking at the flow of energy in our ecosystem, the arrows point to, it follows the energy flow. So energy flows from the sun to producers to primary consumers. So the arrow is showing the direction of the energy flow. Now, I said trophic level earlier. So trophic is basically the nourishment. So a trophic level is at what stage are you actually taking in your nourishment. We have heterotrophs, which hetero is different, troph is nourishment, so they get their nourishment in different ways. So our consumers are going to be heterotrophs because they are unable to transform chemicals or light into chemical energy. So these are going to be our heterotrophs. They get the nutrients in different ways. Some of them eat plants only, so they're herbivores. Some of them eat meat only, so they're carnivores. Others eat both, they're omnivores. You also have saprotrophs, which will feed on dead things and break them down, so like decomposers. And then you have detritivores, which feed on detritus, which is the nourishment that is in the earth from those things that have been decomposed. So these are heterotrophs. They're all taking in nourishment in different ways. Now our autotrophs are able to self-nourish. And so your autotrophs can either be photoautotrophs or they can be chemoautotrophs. Okay, photoautotrophs use light, chemoautotrophs use chemicals. Now, when it comes to the amount of available energy that in an ecosystem, what we tend to see is that it forms this pyramid, okay? So this is an energy pyramid where producers are going to have the most available energy, followed by primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and you reach those top consumers. And this is normal when we see things like apex predators. Remember the predator-prey relationship. Predators hunt things for food. They tend to be at the apex predators tend to be at the top. So what does this mean? As you move up the trophic levels, the amount of available energy decreases. Because of that, the further up you are in these trophic levels, the more you have to consume. So we also see that this trend then is followed with biomass and the numbers. So if I was looking at a biomass pyramid, should also see, especially in terrestrial biomass pyramids, that the amount of available biomass is going to be greater with producers, and as I move up the trophic levels, it also decreases. We see similar things with the pyramid of numbers, where it's just the quantity. You actually count them, how many are there. So we tend to see that same trend. So as you move up in these pyramids, the amounts decrease. Now let's talk about how this would affect something if there was a negative effect. So say for instance, there was a toxin that could not be removed, right? So if there is a toxin that can be removed from tissues, as organisms feed on it moving up the trophic level, the amount of toxin tends to magnify. And the reason why it magnifies is because primary consumers have to eat producers. Secondary consumers eat primary consumers, but because they get less available energy, they're going to eat more. So they will take in more of the toxin. And tertiary consumers are going to eat the secondary consumers, and they're going to have to eat more. So the amount of toxin intensifies as you move up the trophic level, and this is called biological magnification. This is the phenomenon that also almost caused the bald eagles to become extinct, because the toxins were found in the water, which was taken in by small fish. Small fish were eaten by big fish were eaten by the bald eagles, and they had a lot of big fish, so they had a lot of toxins in their tissues, which caused them to lay eggs that were sterile, which almost led to the extinction of the bald eagle. So that is one way that there's a negative effect of having to eat more as you move up in that trophic level. Now, we can represent the flow of energy in ecosystems using either a food chain or a food web. A food chain is showing a single relationship from producers to primary to secondary to tertiary and so forth and so on, whereas a food web is more realistic of what you would see in an actual ecosystem. There is interdependence amongst organisms that live in the same area at the same time. So within those communities, there's interdependence. So if a producer is fed on by a particular primary consumer, and then that was fed on by a secondary consumer, if you were to get rid of this primary consumer, the immediate effect would be an increase in the population of the producers, but a decrease in the population of the secondary consumer. Why? Well, the producers don't have something eating it, so they're going to grow more, but the secondary consumer just lost the food source, so that's going to increase competition. And what we know about when competition increases is you tend to see a decrease in the overall population of that particular species. So there is interdependence within the food webs and the food chains. When you affect one of the species, it can affect all the other species. There are some species within an ecosystem which are called keystone species. These are keystone organisms where they are key to keeping this entire food web intact, and if you were to get rid of one of those or damage those, change their populations, it would affect the entire ecosystem. Now, organisms that live within the same area at the same time sometimes develop symbiotic relationship. Symbiosis means living and working together. If both organisms benefit, we say that is a mutualistic relationship where it's good for them both to work together. Think about a bee and a flower, right? A bee gets nectar from the flower, and as it moves from flower to flower, it helps to pollinate that flower. So that is a mutualistic relationship. A commensalism relationship is one where one of the organisms benefits, but the other one is not harmed, nor is it helped. We often use the cow and the egret example here, where as the cow walks through the pasture, it stirs up the bugs that fly up, and then the egret gets to, get the bugs, or gets to ride on the cow. It's not hurting the cow, not helping the cow, but the egret gets, a free ride or a meal. And the last one is parasitism, where one organism benefits at the expense of the other one, so it actually is harmed. Think of parasites like a tick on a dog, right? The tick's taking blood from the dog, so it's getting a meal, but the dog's getting hurt in the process. So it's parasitism. There are other evolutionary relationships that also evolve. We can see within a population, you can have cooperation where the organisms are actually working together to help them survive. You also can have competition where they're competing for resources like food, water, living space, or mates. The predator-prey relationship where one organism hunts another one as a food source. Just because I'm a predator at one point doesn't mean I'm not also prey. So organisms can be at multiple levels here. You have that plant-herbivore relationship where plants are eaten by herbivores, but also plants have evolved protection mechanisms like thorns or bitter taste or toxins that help to, resist being eaten by these animals. And another relationship they can develop is called mimicry. And mimicry is simply when one organism mimics another organism in order to help them to survive. We often talk about the snakes here, the red and yellow kills a fellow, red and black poisons black, where the snake has different colored bands on it. One of them is poisonous, the other one is not. But to animals, they both look the same, so the one that's not poisonous is avoided as well. So that is called mimicry. Now, when a population, the last thing we're going to talk about, this is the last thing we're going to talk about is density dependent and density independent factors, which can actually limit population growth. So remember, a population is a group of the same organisms living in the same place at the same time. And so different things can limit population's growth. They can be biotic or abiotic. So a biotic factor that will limit population growth may be the availability of prey. Because if there's no food source, it's going to limit how many young can be supported. An abiotic factor may be something like the amount of available water or living space. So each one of these can actually limit the growth patterns of a population. Now, the desired pattern would be an exponential growth curve, right? Which creates this J curve where there's not predators or there's ample food supply and living space. And so we see this exponential growth where the organism begins to grow and it continues to reproduce as much as it needs to or wants to. But what we tend to see in nature, honestly, is logistic growth, which creates this S curve. And so with logistic growth, what happens is the organism population explodes like it would in exponential, but then it switches to this hanging around what's called the carrying capacity. And the carrying capacity is the amount of resources in that area that can support a specific number of organisms. And so what tends to happen is organisms tend to level out around the carrying capacity, where if it overshoots the carrying capacity, the amount of deaths would outweigh the amount of births, or organisms would move out more than they move in, and then it'll kind of level out or play around that carrying capacity line. Here, with an exponential curve, organisms tend to overshoot that carrying capacity. And we see this a lot with invasive species as well, or species that don't have a natural predator. And so they just tend to overgrow. And what happens is this competition between this organism and other organisms will either cause the other organisms to leave or they would have a greater death rate. The last thing we want to talk about is succession. Now, in an ecosystem, things happen that damage that particular ecosystem, and sometimes the damage is severe. But ecosystems are able to recover. So the recovery of an ecosystem is called succession. There's two types of succession, primary and secondary. Primary succession starts on bare rock, okay? In order for plants to grow, they need soil. Something as severe that it would cause primary succession would be like a volcano erupting, or a glacier melting, or a glacier moving across, right? It would scrape everything away from that area, or it would cover everything up, and all you would have left would be rock. And so in order to actually start the process of repairing itself, a pioneer species would need to come in and break that rock down into soil. Pioneer species are things like lichens or moss, and then they can break that rock down into soil. Then the small grasses grow, and then you get your small plants, and then your bushes, and then your softwood trees, and ultimately your hardwood trees. And of course, with each one of those steps, the animals start coming back into the area because they have a habitat and they also have food sources, right? So when we get this completely recovered ecosystem, it's called a climax community. Now, not all climax communities will have hardwood trees. That's just like the natural progression. So going from grass to small plants to bushes to softwood trees to hardwood trees. But when that ecosystem has completely recovered, it's called the climax community, which means it's pretty much stable. It's not completely unchanging, but it's pretty much stable. You know, plants have returned, animals have returned, things like that. Sometimes during succession, a pond will form in the area, but a pond is never a climax community. Ponds will eventually fill in with sediment, so they are never considered a climax community because climax communities are stable. Now, secondary succession happens faster than primary succession because it starts on soil. There's no need to come in and break down rock into soil, which means it gets started faster. The ecosystem can repair itself at a faster rate. It's gonna follow that same pattern. So since you have soil that where life once was before, then the grasses can grow back, then the small plants, then the bushes, then the softwood trees, hardwood trees, so forth and so on. We see secondary succession happen after things like forest fires or tornadoes or things like that that come through. They may destroy the ecosystem, but they do not get rid of everything, including the soil. All right, guys, that's it for part 5. Toodles.